Hey guys, welcome back. So we'll continue rebuilding the CB350F here. First thing first, need to go ahead and torque these bolts here for the cam chain tensioner back up. There's not a listed torque for these, so I'm just kind of torquing them down to, I think it was about 12 Newton meters. Pretty standard for this size bolts. So unfortunately I lost all the audio on these recordings of this part of the video. The mic battery went dead. Okay, so up next I need to go ahead and get the upper case here ready. I need to put the bearings back in. I need to put the large bearing for the starter shaft, jack shaft back in, and of course the plain bearings for the crankshaft. So first I'm gonna go ahead and check this bearing. It feels pretty good. I'm rolling it around there to make sure it doesn't have any spots in it that need to be addressed or needs to be replaced if it has like a crunchy spot. So then we'll go ahead and push it into the case here. It's going to be a little bit stiff because none of them are cold or anything like that. Okay, so once that bearing's in, it's time to put this circlip in very carefully. I'm going to squeeze this together through the other bearing hole and hope for the best and hope it doesn't hit me in the eye. Luckily I have my safety squints on, so we're safe. And it's in. Man, that'll make you nervous right there. Okay, so up next I'm going to install this lower chain rub here. It goes in the bottom case and it's just installed with two little bolts. I was just checking to see which direction it goes here and apparently it doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and install these two 10mm bolts here using Loctite. Okay, after gently running those down with my impact, I'm going to go ahead and torque these down to about 10 Newton meters with the Loctite. Again, there's no torque called for by Honda here, so I'm just going by what other engines would be for similar size bolts and those kinds of things. Okay, so now I'm going to install the next circlip that goes on the inside of this bearing for the start jack shaft. Again, I'm just going to squeeze it together and hope for the best. Get it in the hole there. It goes to the back groove. You got to put this one in first. The clip didn't fully sit into the groove, so I'm using this punch, or actually it's a Allen wrench, to make sure the clip is seated all the way in its groove there, all the way around. Okay, now that I got that first clip installed, it's time to go ahead and install the lower main bearings for the crankshaft. You see there I numbered them when I took it apart, and there's also numbers on the bags and the back of the bearings. You just can't see it there because I wanted to make sure they went back into the same spot and didn't go into a different place. I'm just tapping it into place there with the hammer, so I'm going to go to make sure both sides are flush, so I'm going to go ahead and install the rest of these the same way. One thing to note when installing these bearings, there's a little tab on each of them and there's a corresponding tab in the block, so make sure that goes into there. I'm going ahead and putting a little bit of the Itski's assembly lube on here to help us start up, and this engine's probably going to be sitting for a little while, so I want to make sure it doesn't corrode or get moisture in there or anything like that. Okay, so we're going to switch back to the top case here. First, I'm going to put the dowel pins back in that go in the top case. It has two in the upper area, one there on the right, and then one here on the left. Once those are installed, it's time to go ahead and start putting the case sealant on. I'm using Yama Bond on this Honda because it's what I had, and there's really no difference in between the Honda Bond, the Yama Bond, and the Can-Am Bombardier one. It really doesn't take a lot here. I'm just putting on a thin bead. And then I'm going to go back and spread the bead out once I get the tip unstuck with my finger to make sure there's just an even, relatively thin coating on there. It really doesn't take a lot, and you want to be careful not to get it inside the case because it's going to, it could flake off and stop up the oil filter, which I've seen, or not the oil filter, but the oil pickup. And I've seen that happen on several poorly rebuilt engines. Okay, after I finish putting on all the case sealant, I'm gonna go back and clean up any areas where it's not supposed to be, like on these crank journals right here, or any excess that may be sticking off anywhere else. I'm doing the same thing here and taking any excess case sealant out of any of these bolt holes to keep it from getting stuck down in there and causing problems later. Like I said, I just like to keep it clean on these, so go ahead and cleaning out all these bolt holes.
Okay, now that we've got the gears in, the transmission in, and got the case sealant on, it's time to go ahead and install the main drive here, our power takeoff, and starter ring. So it just goes right in this special chain here. I'm not sure what you call this kind of chain. Make sure you put this in before you go any further with the engine build. Otherwise, you can't get it in once you put the bottom case on, as I found out the hard way. So it's just going to come right in there like that. There it is.
And the audio is gone again, so sorry about that. So I'm gonna go ahead and start putting these bolts in. One thing to note about this is I don't know where they actually came from, because they all just came in a box with this engine since it was already partially taken apart. So I'm just kind of fitting them where I think they should go and looking for a consistent amount of stick out before they're threaded in between all the bolts. So it's a good way to tell if you're not sure where a bolt came from in an engine, especially on a case or something like that. Most of them will have a pretty consistent stick out. Okay, so once I got all the bolts in place, I'm going to use my impact driver here to gently run them down so I just don't have to do it all by hand. I'm going to start in the middle and work my way outward. Okay, so once all the bolts are installed, it's time to torque them down. Honda actually has a torque for this, and it is between 15 foot-pounds and, or 15.9 foot-pounds and about 19 foot-pounds. I set it to 18.5 foot-pounds here, and I'm gonna start torquing them down in the center and work my way out in kind of a crisscross fashion. Once I have these all torqued down the first time, I'm going to go ahead and go back and check them all to make sure it's tight and the case pulled down like it was supposed to. Okay, once I have those all torqued down, it's time to go ahead and install the primary drive and starter drive jack shaft in. There's a spacer on there, so you need to watch out for that, and a circlip and another bearing. So I'm going to go ahead and get those ready. For the first step, I'm going to go ahead and install the jack shaft or shaft from the left side of the engine with the splines going through the starter / primary hub. I'm not going to go all the way yet because I'm just checking the fit for things, and the spacer is going to go in there on the inside of that bearing. So if you'll notice, I actually did this the wrong way at first. I installed the bearing before I put the spacer in. Unfortunately, the bearing has to go in first, so I went ahead and installed all this and then had to pull it back out and then put that spacer behind that bearing right there. Okay, so once you have the bearing back out, you can put the spacer in with the smaller end or the non-flanged end towards the bearing. Then you can go ahead and install the bearing and the circle clip back in and push the shaft all the way through. Okay, so I was just making sure it turns freely there. And then the last piece to go in is going to be this, it's the primary drive gear that goes on the right side of this shaft on the spline. I was just kind of seeing which way it goes there. And then it's going to have a bolt that goes on the outside. I didn't torque it down right now, I just ran it down by hand, but that bolt is going to be torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. I'll do that once I have the clutch on later. Okay, so now that the engine's back over, it's time to go ahead and install the bolts on the top side. Similar to the bottom side, they weren't marked and I didn't know where they went exactly, so I'm having to compare the stick out. Make sure it's even for light type bolts. Like I said, most of them stick out about ½ an inch or so, or about 1 centimeter. I mean, it really depends on the engine exactly, but most of them are pretty similar. So once I have them all where I need them to go, I'm going to use my impact to gently run them down again. I'm doing these larger 12mm bolts first, or they have a 12mm head. Once I have those bolts in place, I'm going to go ahead and torque the larger 12mm headed bolts down to the same 18.5 foot-pounds, just like on the bottom side of the case. There's just 3 of them, 2 in the front there, then 1 in the back, as you can see. Once I have those bolts done, I'm going to use my impact to run down all the 10mm head bolts gently again, and then I'll use my torque wrench to torque those down as well. Okay, so these bolts, I'm going to torque them down to 10 Newton meters. That's what the manual calls for on these as well. Okay, so after this, we're going to go ahead and move on to assembling some of the accessories for the lower end, and then move on to working on the upper end of the engine. Thanks for watching. Sorry about the audio, and hope to see you again next time.